Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Welcome to this live stream on Valentine's Day. So I'm guessing we are each other's Valentines or something, which is maybe a bit sad, at least for me. I'll be your Valentine, it's okay. Question, does the country where you come from, do they actually celebrate Valentine's Day, or is that like not really a thing where you're from? I'm from the Netherlands. You probably know that, and it's mostly seen as a sort of commercial thing here, so we're not really that much into buying chocolates and flowers and everything. So I thought, well, you know what, why not do a live stream, because we're not doing anything else this evening, so to me that seemed like a good idea. So something really interesting happened this weekend. I noticed that somebody posted a comment which was like criticism on me using a mechanical keyboard. Basically saying, yeah, you shouldn't use that, it's too noisy, it's really disturbing, please use a softer sounding keyboard. So data-driven as I am, I thought, hey, let's ask it, you know, we could do a poll and see what people think. So I did a poll on Sunday, basically asking, should I use the mechanical keyboard? Should I use a softer sounding keyboard? Or I don't really care what keyboard you use, it doesn't matter. That's the correct answer, by the way. But the result was very interesting. There were more than 6,000 votes until now, and basically almost half of you said, keep using the mechanical keyboard. 44% said, I don't really care, which makes a lot of sense. And 9% said, use a softer sounding keyboard. So I thought that was very interesting. This is the one I'm using, by the way. This is the Keychron K2. Yeah, K2. It's wireless and with Gateron brown switches. I honestly think it sounds pretty good. To me, it didn't sound very disturbing in my recordings, but I also have this keyboard, which is like my backup keyboard, Apple Magic Keyboard. I mean, it's not bad, but to me, the mechanical one feels a bit more natural. And it is, of course, your main interface to your whole IDE and everything you do when you're writing code. Especially if you rely a lot on shortcuts, then it's definitely nice to have a nice feeling keyboard. But in the end, you know, if I create content on YouTube and most people find that the mechanical keyboard is too noisy, then I'd happily switch to a softer sounding keyboard. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So we'll keep using it. We'll keep it like this. No changes. Changes are bad. We're not going to do that. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so let's see. So who is actually celebrating Valentine's Day here? Oh, in Brazil you celebrate in June. That's interesting. I didn't know there were actually multiple dates for that. Yeah, Barcelona you celebrated. Good. Yeah. Oh, there's some people from New York, Paris. Welcome. JP Morgan's offices at Canary Wharf. Nice. Greetings from India. Cool. So what I'm going to do today is, just as usual, I'm going to answer any questions that you might have. Just post them in the chat if you want to post a question. I have a few questions I want to go through first that you sent me on my post that I made a couple of days ago. So I'll go through them first, and then if you want to ask anything, just post it in the chat and I'll try to answer as many as possible. All right, so we are going to start with a question by Yao Marcos. Have you read the Python Fluent book? No, unfortunately not. You could make suggestions on books for Python developers from beginners to advanced ones. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's the weird thing is for me, I don't really read a lot of software development pure books. To me, they are often quickly outdated because the release notes of the language and the website containing documentation and tutorials on Python is way more accurate, it's way more current, because every time a new version comes out, well, things change. So I don't tend to read a lot of books about software development in Python. I mean, there's definitely a few interesting books. Like I read both the Robert Martin books, the Clean Code and Clean Architecture ones. I really like both of them. There's the Programmer's Brain that I keep recommending you read. That's also really cool, which is not really a book on learning Python, but it's very much about how your brain works and what it means if you're a developer, how you process information, and some tricks and tips you can take into account when you're looking at code to make that go more efficiently. So I thought that was really nice. But to be honest, I'm spending quite a bit of time now. I've kind of landed in a sort of personal development, personal growth black hole of books. There's like tons of books about business and personal development, and it's all really interesting. I learned a lot from that, and so I'm currently reading more of those books. But I'll definitely think about maybe doing a video soon where I cover a few of the Python and software design books. That could be cool. Next question by Garrisonator. Inheritance on a database and ORM might be an interesting topic. Yeah, for sure. On the one hand, you know, databases, they're not really, in a sense, object-oriented. They're object-oriented in the sense that you could consider basically each table a class and each row in the table an object, right? And then it has columns. It's of course very data-oriented, but where I think inheritance mainly brings benefits is really in modifying behavior. And I mean, I don't use inheritance that much either. I mainly use it to define an interface and then somewhere else implement that interface. I keep the levels of inheritance in my code pretty low. 1, sometimes 2 levels, but basically that's it. And that's also what most of the design patterns try to do, because every time you add another layer of inheritance, well, things are going to get more complex and it's going to be harder to follow what is going on in your code. Often a simple composition-based approach works better and gives cleaner, simpler results. It's in my experience. So for databases, that's sort of the same thing, although there is, of course, always a discussion between, hey, should you use SQL statements, which is the query language used for databases, even though that's not standardized either. And you have ORMs, which are more, let's say, object-oriented way of looking at data and querying data and doing things with data. Actually, I'm working on a video right now covering that topic, so that's going to be out soon on the channel. Let's see. Martin asked, this is a follow-up on the toilet paper controversy. Wash the toothbrush before or after use? I'd say both. I mean, you want to wash it before because it's going to be completely dry, so you want to at least clean it a bit, right? And not washing your toothbrush after you've used it sounds a bit disgusting to me. So both. Yeah. Oh, so that's actually, those are the questions already. That's going pretty fast. All right. I'm going to scroll up and see what questions have been posted in the chat so far. Let's see. Where do we have the first question? I'm going to start at the top. Okay, Akshat asks, my company wants me to work on some Web3 related project, but I don't think it's best for me. I would like to go for data science. I'm a full stack developer with 2 years of experience. Okay, yeah, what's the question exactly? So do you want to help with what type of decision you should take? I mean, if you work at a company, you have limited control also over what you're going to do, right? If the core thing that the company does is developing Web3 projects, well, you're probably going to have to adapt because that's what the company prescribes. So that would probably mean going for another job. I think both of these domains are interesting and there's a lot of growth there, even in Web3, even though yeah, it's not really clear where all of that is going, obviously. But I think both of these are good target areas for you where you can potentially learn a lot. So if it's easy for you to make that switch, I'd say pick the one that you think brings you the most personally in terms of development, and then go for that. Let's see. Abhishek says, can you make a video on system design graph database? Yeah, I haven't looked at graph databases yet, but I think that's actually an interesting topic. In general, I'm wondering, I should maybe do another poll about that, what I should focus on basically in the coming year. So I've done a lot of software design videos until now. I've had most of the design patterns. I've talked about cohesion, coupling. I've talked about tons of different Python tools. And I mean, I can probably just continue with that like for years because there's just so much. But I think it would also be interesting to dive a bit into other topics. And I've noticed two of them are that I generally see lots of comments about, which is software testing, which I did a few things about, but not that many, and software architecture. So the whole, let's say, cloud-based systems, deployment, security, authentication, those kind of things. And I think both of these could potentially be interesting to do more content about. So I'll probably make a poll and ask you in a few days which of these two you find the most interesting. And I think the system design graph database is a good example of what fits well with the architecture topic. All right, let's see. What else do we have? Ashe asks, what are your thoughts on following clean architecture pattern with framework like Django, where it has its own pragmatic design? Yeah, that's always the thing with using frameworks like Django, is that they're going to prescribe sort of how you're supposed to set up things. So I don't think imposing your own architecture is going to work all that well, because you're going to fight the platform a lot, because the platform has been conceived in a certain way. So I don't think that's a really good idea if you think, hey, I want to use that architecture, but Django uses something else, so now I'm going to still use Django, but then force myself to use my own thing, and then you get all kinds of conflicts. It doesn't really work that way. So typically it would be better to do the other way around, where, well, you start with what you think is a good architecture for your setup, and then look at tools and platforms that support that architecture. And if you can't find them, well, sometimes you have to make the practical choice as well, and simply change your mind about things. I can give you an example of that. In the TypeScript domain. So I think that's already 1.5 years ago, we moved from basically our own sort of project setup to using Next.js, which is like really popular at the moment. And we did a few things differently. Like, for example, we had translations in the system. It was actually a nice system that handled translations really nicely. We had an English version and a Dutch version. And we wanted to keep that system. But Next.js was just not compatible with it. So then we had to make a choice. Okay, are we going to stick to our guns and really keep using our system, which we actually prefer for translations? Or are we just going to stop fighting and then, okay, use Next.js translation system, even though that's not our preferred way of doing? And ultimately, we did the second thing because it's not worth the fight over. Customers really didn't care. And it really made things a lot easier for us by just adapting ourselves and letting go of some of the really strict ideas we had about how to set up everything. All right, Tanyiko says, quick question, not about Valentine's Day. I already like your question. I probably asked before, is your course good for other languages, Java, Kotlin, to improve thinking as future developer? So for sure, the course is very much focused on Python, because I'm using only Python examples. So if you start with those examples, well, they're not in Java. So that's going to be a bit harder to translate. On the other hand, the principles that I talk about there generic. The design principles are not tied to particular languages, although, you know, sometimes languages don't have certain syntax elements, so they don't support certain things. Like, for example, Java doesn't have standalone functions, and there is quite a bit of content where I use functions instead of classes, because to me that feels more natural in Python. So those things you can immediately transfer easily to Java. So that's something to keep in mind. Nasser asks, do you like other programming languages? Yeah, I mean, I really like TypeScript a lot. I really enjoy using that. We've built a whole platform using TypeScript. I'm not that finicky with programming language, though I did have to get used to Python actually in the beginning, especially with the fact that indentation has a meaning and a few other quirks of Python that are just different. But I really like TypeScript a lot. I've also had a lot of fun programming in C++ for years. Java I find a bit verbose. I don't really enjoy working in Java all that much. But I haven't yet spent enough time, I think, on exploring some of the newer languages like Rust and Julia. I'd really like to spend a bit more time there. All right. Next question. Let's see. Chris asked a question that's not coding related. I've been watching a lot of Not Just Bikes. And now I'm curious as to what my commute is like. Yeah, so I'm Dutch, so obviously I have at least 2 bikes. I think every Dutch person has at least 2 bikes. And I bike to my office, and it's actually pretty close. I normally drop off the kids at school, which is like 5 minutes. And then my office, which is where I'm sitting right now, is about 10 minutes away. So I rarely take the car. I've actually just now came here by car because it's evening and I didn't want to take the bike anymore, so I just came by car, but it's like 10 minutes, so for me that works really well. And I like being outside a bit and getting some fresh air. So let's see. Sudhakar asks, can you please do a video on selection of database based on requirements? OLAP, OLTP system design. Yeah, I'm not really sure what you mean with OLAP, OLTP system design and how it relates to databases. The main choice that I've had to make in the past is between SQL and NoSQL. Like I said, I haven't really used graph databases yet. And there are some advantages and disadvantages there. Like the SQL databases are pretty easy to set up. There's a ton of services that offer these things. Most cloud providers allow you to just spin up a database very quickly. It's very well known in the industry. One thing about SQL databases is that they don't really scale all that well. If you have a large number of users, it becomes actually quite hard to scale it up and keep the database fast enough, whereas NoSQL database have solutions for that, like sharding and things like that. So if you're thinking about really a scalable application, then I think NoSQL is very good. If you don't need that, then a SQL database is pretty nice, and you can use query builders and tools like that to access the data. And there's lots of packages in Python that can help you as well. All right, Tom asks, what's your recommended path to become a senior Python developer? So I think what happens in lots of places that universities or schools teach you how to become a junior developer. So they teach you how to code. They're pretty technical studies. I think the step from junior to senior developer really involves 2 different things. So one is you need to become better at the tool, and you need to get the practical knowledge of tools and programming languages. When you're just out of school, you kind of have passing knowledge of how everything works, but the practical knowledge in the end is going to make a huge difference in how comfortable you are with programming languages like Python. So there's that aspect. But I think a lot of aspects of becoming a senior developer depend not so much on your technical skills, but on your people skills. And I mean, you're going to need to work in a team. You're going to need to understand, maybe lead some other junior developers, set up projects, have an idea of if you want to develop something with a team of people, how much time is that going to take? What's the required budget? What are things to think about? What's the most efficient way to get there? So I think those are the things that are really important to learn as senior developer. You don't really learn that in school. That's mostly what you learn by experience. And back to the technical side, I think an important thing is, in particular, software design. I think most studies, they have a course on that, but then that's basically where it stops, right? But I think it's really helpful to really internalize software design and being able to take those principles, those ideas, and apply them to your code. And that's going to save you lots of time. It's going to help you write much better code and take better decisions overall. ArjanLive, okay, I see you published an online course. Can you tell us what differentiates this course from other courses on Udemy? Yeah, so I've created a whole page which contains exactly the modules that are there and what the course is about. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for me to go into details and do like a comparison with all of the courses on Udemy. For me, the online course, what I try to do is think about let's say, instead of thinking about the topics and the content, which, well, that is software design, I try to approach it slightly differently, more from a transformation point of view. So what I try to set up the course in such a way that it helps people take that transformation from, let's say, a junior developer to a more senior developer. And that means you need, of course, to cover topics like software design, but also a lot of content that I do is more about, in the course, about helping you practice with those things, explaining different facets of that and doing things a bit differently, I'd say. That might not be suitable for you, but I think there's also already a lot of information online. Of course, I also do that in my YouTube videos, where I also try to follow that same idea of not so much like providing a bunch of information, but also covering the why of things. Why do we do things in a certain way, and what does it mean? So that also comes back in the course. Niso asks, have you always been into software? Was it always what you pursued growing up? Yeah, it started pretty early. My first computer was a 8086 computer with like a green monochrome screen. And it had DOS on it, and I could run basic programs. So basically I was just playing around with it, and I really liked that a lot. I made like little stupid games in BASIC, which was quite kind of fun. I even got like, there's this magazine in the Netherlands called Kijk, Watch, and it's like a popular science magazine. And they had this section in the middle of the magazine, which was just pages of code, basically. People submitted like a small basic program, which was like 20, 30 lines of code, and you could type the code in BASIC, and then it would, I don't know, show something funny or do something interesting. And I really loved that a lot. I had also books with code where basically you had a book which had like an adventure game, so I could just write 20 pages of code, and then hopefully there was a game coming out of that. It almost never worked because you always make a mistake when you try to copy over 20 pages of code, but that was actually a really fun thing to work on. So that's how I got started. Then I learned C++, which really helped me become better at software development, and then things that just progressed from there, basically. All right, next question. Akshat asks, have you used Sphinx? Can you please make a documentation video? No, I haven't used Sphinx, but it is a good suggestion to do documentation video. That would be interesting. Let's see. Oh, Max writes, thanks for your excellent content. Strong support from Israel. Thank you so much. Thanks, man. And ArjanLive also asked another question. And thank you. Do you believe in efforts to modernize energy using software? See, for example, Tesla, McKinsey Energy, or Energy Complete startups, given climate change, etc. Yeah, I definitely believe in that. I have a friend of mine who's actually involved in a startup company that does logistics. Basically they built electric charging parks for retailers like Amazon and companies like that. And I think you can win a lot by having software that actually plans when you should charge, where you should charge, that does things like computing what the availability is of charge points, optimizing how fast you charge depending on the battery that you're using. So I think there is a ton of software that's been developed to help with that. So I definitely think that's a really interesting area to work in, actually, and I'm sure that's going to grow even more in the coming years. I just read that the European Union actually wants to ban all petrol cars, well, at least selling new ones, by 2035, and the Netherlands is even pushing up the schedule to 2030, which is pretty soon, and Norway might even do it already in a few years. So that transition is definitely happening, and there's a lot of work to be done in terms of, well, that's just the electric cars aspect. Of course, we also have the whole infrastructure of homes that need electricity with solar and wind, and optimizing the grid so that things don't come crashing down. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and there's going to be a lot of work there as well. All right, Walter asks, why use session equals depends get session in fast API and parse it in CRUD gets items session? If you can import the get session function, declare session in the CRUD file and use it in the file. That's a very specific question. I'm not really sure I can answer that right here, but I will take a look at it and maybe I can do a follow-up video about it. Let's see. Oh, I skipped a few questions. I see. Wait, let me just scroll back up. Arjan, do you know R? I find that most R programs are very chaotic. How could I apply better refactoring, cleaner code principles to R? Do you know any good resource? I've worked very little with R, to be honest. I've very quickly switched to Python whenever I needed to do something with data. I've seen a few examples of people using R, but I'm not sure how popular it is. I feel like people are mostly moving to Python from R, so I would not spend too much time on that, to be honest. So no, I don't really know it. Guinea Pig Mart, what are your thoughts on Pygame Community Edition? Yeah, I'm looking into developing a little fun game actually as a Python program. Now, Python is not really used for game development. I mean, it's not performant enough for that, though it might be a good language to use in a game engine. And Blender, of course, relies heavily on Python. So Pygame actually looks nice. Yeah, I would definitely consider using that. Rayan asks, do you recommend Google Cloud Architect certification? Depends, I think, on where you want to work. I think the smaller companies, they don't really care about these things. But if you work at a slightly bigger company, then they will put value in these sort of certificates. I mean, it's very, let's say, practical oriented. If you have a Google Cloud Architect certificate, then you're going to know how to build things in Google Cloud, but you won't really know how to do it in AWS or in Azure. So that's something to keep in mind. Luca asks, is Python a good programming language for building POC of systems that are then implemented in other languages such as Java, Golang, Rust, and C++? So really for prototyping. Yeah, I think it definitely works for that. I mean, Python is really good for setting up something very quickly and just trying things, because there's just such a low threshold for getting started. You don't need to install lots and lots of different things. You don't need to compile anything. It's just you define a script and you run it. So it's pretty easy to just set up something simpler. So yeah, highly recommend that. We actually did that a couple of times in my company, where I wanted to try out something. So I quickly cooked up a Python script and just played around a bit with classes and functions and just checking how to set it up. So that works pretty well. Kervi asks, what are the best Python tools or practical methodologies to achieve reliability when building a script or a small application? So the most important thing is tests. You need to write tests. And that means before you can do that, you need to set up your code so that you can easily test it. Because if you can't easily test your code, then you're just not going to test it properly. That's just how humans work. So it helps to use design principles, such as introduce some abstraction, use dependency injection to provide objects to other objects or functions, and then you can replace them by mock versions of those objects. So try to, if you're really concerned about reliability, set up your code from the start with testing in mind. And you can, of course, take that a step further where you're actually writing the test first before you actually write any code. And that's basically what test-driven development is. And then it's always good to think about other types of tests that you can do, because that's not just unit test, obviously, that you need to do. You can also do integration test, where you test a combination of different systems. You can do data integrity test, where you make sure that your data still makes sense. That has actually saved us from a lot of problems in the past, where we just checked that if there is in the database some ID pointing to another row, another table, that we check that that row actually exists. And we found a few bugs that way. So just testing the integrity of your data is actually a really good idea. Weiser Hase, I'm currently studying computer science in Germany, and my professors always tell us to use inheritance. Do you think the education system should change and focus more on composition and functional approaches? What I've noticed in many computer science studies is that a lot of the teachers, they have themselves been raised with the idea of object-oriented programming and object-oriented design. Now, most computer science studies will have a course on functional programming, but that's basically the extent of it. And lots of teachers, they stick to really the classes, inheritance, and object-oriented design. And that's a pity, because in practice, especially if you have a language like Python, where you don't have to depend on classes and method, but you can also use regular functions, which are really powerful in Python. Well, in that case, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to keep pushing for inheritance. But also the thing is that that's not really a good alternative to teach those things. I mean, most of those courses, they still refer to the design patterns book from the 90s, and they don't really look at newer things, I'd say. So I think it would be good if the education system changes and that it focuses a bit less on object-oriented programming. But that's also a difference between what you do in the education system and what's actually happening in practice, which often is quite different. Let's see. Question. Sorry, I just want to know if Web3 is the right choice, as was Hype 2 years ago. But Hype is going down every day. I want to grow, but can't decide which is the best choice, Web3 or data science. Yeah, I mean, if you look at data science, I mean, that's really an area that's still growing a lot. I mean, I don't think most companies actually use data enough to take better decisions, and they need to if they want to stay competitive in the current domain. So there's definitely going to be a lot of demand for data scientists, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities there. So for me, that would be, personally, I would find that a more interesting direction, but of course I can't decide that for you. Web3 to me is, yeah, I'm not sure. It's still, let's say it was a hype indeed a few years ago, but it's not really clear what's going to happen with that. And so I'd say that's, yeah, I wouldn't see that as like, okay, I'm going to fully focus on Web3 now, and that's going to be my thing, because in 1 year there's going to be Web4 or something else. And then, well, you went with that direction, whereas data science, understanding data, modeling data, processing data, that's something that's companies are going to keep doing, especially now with all the machine learning tools that we're seeing nowadays. All right, Keith, question: how to set up a new project with linting, I think, formatting, making a package, testing with PyTest, etc. Yeah, so there's not really an answer in the sense that I can tell you, okay, these are the steps in which you set this up. And if you set up a new project, there's going to be some core components that are going to be part of it that you're going to need to include. I have sort of a standard setup for myself in VS Code, where I already by default enable the black auto formatter. I do a cleanup of the imports whenever I save a file and a couple of those things. So that's already helps a lot. But there's also, if you look at a new project, there's going to be a couple of standard things you're going to have in there, like documentation, tests. You will have a source folder. You might have a wiki for developers, and there's a couple of other things as well. I might do a video where I dive into a bit more detail. So, Internet O Statisky. Python is often used in data engineering. Do you think about video on good Python practices in that field? Yeah, I think that's maybe even one of the main reasons that my channel has taken off in the past, I think. I think when I've asked the questions a couple of times to you in the past about like what area are you from, and what I see is that there's a lot of people who come from a data science domain, but they don't have a computer science background, which makes sense, right? There are data science studies. There's people coming from all kinds of areas flowing into data science, and that's actually a problem, because that means that when you don't have that computer science background, you probably don't have the experience with things like software design and design patterns and things that I talk about on the channel. And then you start with writing simple scripts to analyze your data, which works because you've been taught in school that Python can be used as a tool to do data science. But then when things become more complex, then quickly it becomes problematic. Like, I probably need to test these things. And how do I set this up so that I can actually manage this properly? And actually what really surprised me is I did some workshops also in the past, that some companies, well, they're publishing papers, or research institutes are publishing papers, and they didn't even consider that they were supposed to test their software. So if you don't test your software, how can you be sure that the results you're getting from your data analysis are accurate? You can't be sure. I mean, they're actually probably going to be wrong because you didn't test edge cases, and you didn't test that it actually measures the thing that you want to measure. So, yeah, I'm not even sure what the question was anymore. I think I veered off in a different direction. But good Python practices in the field of data engineering means doing things like software design. And I might do a few videos in the future on more data-oriented projects. I did a code roast already a while ago on a data-focused project, but I might revisit those type of things in the future. All right, Azanul asks, I'm a software developer with almost 2 years of experience. I left my last job at a fast-growing startup because of the toxic work environment. Now I need to relocate to Berlin. I'm from India, but unable to land an interview there. How should I go about it? Yeah, the thing is, I think it also depends very much on the country where you're applying to jobs. Some countries, some companies are going to be more friendly towards either remote working or people who are not from the area. I've noticed that in some other companies I've worked with as well. In the Netherlands, it's mostly Dutch people, whereas I think, hey, it could be actually nice for a company to have developers from different backgrounds, because I think it's valuable if you have people with different cultural backgrounds, different ways of thinking and working, and put them together, because as a company you need as broad as possible view on a problem to actually be able to solve it. But I would expect that it would have become easier since COVID, since more people are now working remote. So it should be easier to find a job. I think the problem is if you are from India and you want to relocate to Berlin or a European country, is that there's visa problems. Basically, you're going to need to apply for a visa, and a lot of companies are just not willing to go through the trouble to do that. So they simply ignore anybody who needs a visa because that's just too complicated. So I think that's where you probably run into problems. And there's not really an easy way to fix it. I mean, that's really a limitation on how the world works, and it's a pity that it's like this. I mean, in my company, we've also been looking for people in the past, and it was very hard to find the right people. But also, if people come from far and they're going to need a visa, it's for a company this can be very risky, because you might hire that person and the visa might not go through. There might be all sorts of issues. There's high cost associated with that. So especially if you're a smaller company, that's actually really a showstopper for hiring people outside of Europe, basically. And I'm guessing that's the same for lots of other countries. All right, let's see. Martin, do you ever use Jupyter notebooks? Why or why not? Not really use them a lot. I'm mainly using Python at the moment for, let's say, automating and making connections between tools. So Jupyter notebooks don't really work for me. For example, I've built quite a few automations in that run in the cloud. Like, for example, I have an Instagram account, and there is a URL that refers to the latest video. So I just made like a small Python script that once a week retrieves the latest video from the YouTube API and then updates the CNAME record in Cloudflare so that the URL points to the latest video and stuff like that. Like I built some things for invoicing, for processing refunds and things like that. So I'm mainly using Python for that purpose, and I think it works really well for that, but I don't really need Jupyter notebooks for that. All right, Jamil, how can you become the good software developer? Yeah, it's a very generic question. Obviously, you need to develop your skills. You need to become more comfortable with applying design principles and design patterns, and being able to logically construct a program and set it up in a way that it's easy to read so that other people can work on it if necessary, that it's easy to change so that you can easily add features and make it better, and that it's also easy to test so that it's going to be reliable. Those are the core things that you need to become better at. Ismail, can you make a video about actually building something than teaching abstract Python examples? Yeah, I try to make the videos less abstract. I mean, especially it's very easy to make things very abstract if you talk about design principles, but I have to cover the concept in some way in the videos. But what I do try is to use a code example that's actually close to something you could potentially use in a production environment. So I do try my best to make code examples that are actually practical, that you can actually apply to real-world projects. Sinan asks, as a Python developer, I hate the syntax of other languages. Is this happening to you too? It actually also happens the other way around. I mean, I get sometimes even comments from people, you should use a real language. Python is a toy language. And I think Python developers are sometimes doing the same thing on web development channels. So there's like this whole anonymity going on. But I think it's a question of what you're used to. For me, Python feels pretty natural right now, and I've sort of gotten used to the quirks, and I kind of enjoy how Python is set up. Some things I think Python really should fix, basically. I think the whole type annotation system is kind of half finished, and it's not tightly integrated enough into the language. I think they should really make some steps into incorporating that more. And I also think Python is not strict enough in the sense that you can basically change everything with donder methods and how everything works. Now that's cool, but also might lead to unexpected behavior if you look at a piece of code, and that makes the code just hard to understand. So I would actually be in favor of a strict version of Python that forces you to use type hints more explicitly and kind of disabled some of the donder methods, like overriding the way that inheritance works or something. All right, Marton, don't have time to watch the stream. Well, it's going to be recorded on YouTube, so you can always watch it later. Keep up the good work. Yes, will do, obviously. Karan, will we ever see you branching out to other languages? Yeah, I've been. That's always something I'm thinking about. Like, to me, my YouTube channel is. I mean, I do mainly Python stuff, but I mean, I'm not in particular tied to Python. I like the language, but you know, if I noticed that most of you actually move to follow, let's say, another language that's then getting more popular and more people are using it, well, then I don't have any qualms switching languages. But that's always, I mean, that's also pretty hard. Like, if I suddenly switch to web development with TypeScript or something, I think a lot of people are going to leave because, well, you might find it interesting, but I think a large part of my audience are data scientists, so you wouldn't like that type of content very much. So if I were to do something like that, I would probably start a second channel on that topic and then take it from there. But I'm not even sure I should do that. I mean, that's also will take me a lot of time, and I could also focus that time on making the videos even better and just trying to do an even better job at producing the Python videos. So it's a question of focus. I comment, Arjan, you provide one-on-one private consulting if someone needs your help. People can find help on Upwork or Code Mentor. Yeah, I don't really do private consulting at the moment. I feel like with my current schedule, actually creating content is really a lot of hard work. We spend a lot of time, I have a small team now, we spend a lot of time on preparing the code examples, making sure the quality is good, doing reviews of everything, continuously analyzing how we can make the content better. So that's more the model. So I don't really have the time to do one-on-one private consulting, though I do offer a version of my course which has a tier where you get a code review by me, basically. So you can order that, and then you can send your code to me in a Git repository, and then I'll do a review of it. Danny, is there any other approach apart from using interfaces via abstract class in Python for reducing coupling to external libraries, and how interfaces apply to functional programming? Yeah, so we have two ways in Python that you can use. You have abstract base classes, which have been there for many years. which rely on the idea of inheritance to provide abstraction. So you define the abstract base class, and that's your abstraction that you're using to decouple things. The other way to do it, and that's more recent, that's with protocol classes. And the nice thing about protocol classes is that they do everything basically that abstract base classes do, so you don't really need abstract base class anymore. But they also allow you to not use the inheritance part. So, and that's because protocols, as opposed to abstract base classes, which use nominal typing, protocols rely on structural, or actually not really structural typing, but on doc typing. And so that means that as long as the interface follows, or as long as your implementation follows what the protocol prescribes in terms of methods and properties, then you can use it. So those are two ways to do it. A third way to do it is actually by using types. So if you have let's say you have a function, and that function expects as an argument another function, let's say a callable that, I don't know, takes an integer and returns another integer or whatever you would like, then that's also a level of abstraction, because you supply it with a specification of what a function should accept and what it should return. So you can also use that as a method of decoupling things. So instead of directly defining what function you're going to call, you could turn it into a higher order function, you pass a function, and then using the callable type annotation, you specify what you're going to need. But that's also an example of decoupling. Anonymous, how wrong is it to want to reuse my Flask Docker container? Why is Docker so obsessed with treating containers as disposable only? Yeah, I mean, one reason why Docker is so popular is because of this disposability of Docker containers. Basically, the whole cloud architectures are built on the idea that Docker containers are something that's disposable, that you can just spin up, and you can have multiple containers of the same thing at once, and you can just kill them again and then restart them. And that's what makes scalable cloud architectures possible. So you could, of course, try to reuse your container, but, well, it goes sort of against the idea of the problem that Docker is trying to solve, which is that we don't really care anymore about the service specifically, but we care about the fact that we're able to start them, scale them very quickly, and that these things just work independently from each other. Ennis asks, building a full project from scratch in Python, like a REST API, together with a test and CI/CD pipeline would be really nice. Could be an idea for live coding. Yeah, maybe I could do something like that in the future. I don't really do a lot of these live codings on my channel. I mean, the closest that I get is probably the code roasts, but there it's also more about refactoring, so this could be nice. What I'm always a bit concerned about is that it's basically really boring, because you're going to see me make a bunch of mistakes and it's going to take a long time. So I'm not really sure that's going to be that interesting. But, well, if you would like to see those things, I could do a poll about that to find out. Akshat asks, is there some feature or syntax that other languages have and you would like to see it in Python someday? Yeah, specifically, I would really like to have the way that TypeScript defines function types. I think that's just so much cleaner than the whole callable mess in Python. So I would really love to have that in Python. And another thing that I would also really like to have in Python is how do you call it? Like the nullable operator. So if you have like the dot syntax, where you go like deeper into an object, you can use I think that's TypeScript also has this, but some other languages also have it, where you use the question mark, and then if the if the member variable is there, then it continues. Otherwise, it just returns null or undefined in Python. And then you don't have to do lots of if statements to check whether the thing exists. And if so, you're going to get the next sub thing, etc. Though it does promote breaking the law of Demeter if you have that kind of syntax options. Okay. Danny asks, how do I convince people with no understanding in the value of modular code that we should try to make the code modular? Well, one thing that I like to do is ask really targeted questions, like how easy is to test this? Or if we were to change this, what would be the required work to actually do that change? And the less modular your code is, the more work it's going to be, the harder it's going to be to test. And I mean, obviously, code nowadays is changing very quickly. We want constantly new features. We're constantly refactoring. I mean, I'd say if you're coding, you're spending probably most of your time moving things around and refactoring versus writing line by line new code, right? So in that sense, if you can save time on the things that you spend the most time on, which is refactoring and cleaning up and moving things around, then it makes a lot of sense to use a modular design. All right, I comment, do you believe, oh, I already got that one. Now let me scroll down a bit further. Seraphim asks, when is an inheritance tree too deep? At some point it might get ridiculously deep, too many levels. What do we devise to keep inheritance hierarchy shorter? Yeah, so this is also what you see in most of the design patterns, actually. If you look at even the classic design patterns book, I think there's only a few patterns that actually use more than one level of inheritance. And that's, I think, the decorator and maybe one or two more. Most patterns actually don't use any deep levels of inheritance at all. So I'd say keep it to maximum 2. Mostly you will use, it's even better to just use one level of inheritance and purely use it as a way to define interfaces that connect things. And then what happens is that you start to rely more on composition instead. And that's also what most of the design patterns actually do. And that's actually a really great starting point. Tech Dives ask, what's your view on 9 to 5? I receive annually 120k in McKinsey, 130 in Energy Complete, and 160k in Goldman, but all were 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. You prefer independence, YouTube, even though for a lower salary. Yeah, for me, money is not really the end goal of life or something. I try to find, I mean, I've also said it, I think in one of the earlier live streams, that personally, I'm not really that interested in working at one of the big tech companies. I know that a lot of people are like saying, yeah, you want to work at Google and that's like your dream job or something. But I think in terms of work, I mean, for me, it would be a very imbalanced view of how I do work. I think work for me in principle should be something that helps me grow personally. And in order to grow personally, I need a proper balance between work and private life. And well, to be honest, that balance has been kind of gone the last months because, well, I'm running the YouTube channel, which really takes up a lot of my time. And I also run another company, which takes a lot of my time. But I'm shifting things around a bit to simplify things for me. So for me, I really don't like working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. If I can avoid that, I would happily take a lower salary so that I feel more balanced and so that I have a more calmer life where I can spend some time with my wife and my kids. But YouTube is definitely not a calm life, by the way. It's been a very busy period because, especially since I'm independent, basically. I mean, the YouTube income currently pays my salary, sort of. So it means I also have to spend a lot of time making sure that I do the things that keep the YouTube channel alive, and that I do the right things, that I develop courses so that I have some income so I can pay my team, etc. But once you've set that up, it's actually really, it's for me, it's a really nice way of working, because I get to play around with a bunch of cool toys like cameras and lenses and stuff like that. I get to explore software and new tools, play around with them, and also have a challenge of developing my teaching skills and always learning how I can explain things better. So I really enjoy doing that. So for me, this is like the greatest job ever, basically. Let's see. Mr. Sticklife, do you think DevOps, machine learning ops, is a safe path? Well, for the coming few years, probably yes. I mean, people are going to need experts in how to deploy things to the cloud, and same thing for machine learning models. But you definitely see that this is getting simpler. I mean, especially with Kubernetes, there's a lot of work that's basically been taken off your hands, and you just follow the way that you should do it in Kubernetes. And well, you still need to know how Kubernetes works, obviously, but it's already getting a lot simpler. And if you look at what's happening, what the cloud providers are doing, where you have all kinds of varieties of things, like you have very simple mechanism of just deploying a simple function, and then if you go post some data to a URL, then it runs that function, and you don't have to worry anymore about the server side of things, scaling things up, etc. That's all handled for you. So that's going to just be more and more and more, and that means that the DevOps work is going to be less. Though you might actually have more challenges in the area of security and privacy, data protection, those kind of things. All right, let's see. Alberto, thanks for your videos. You're making me a better Python developer. I'm really happy to hear that. Thank you so much. Walter, how to plan, design your folder structure for a project? Are you using templates, or is there some guideline to set it up? Yeah, I do have a sort of standard template of how I set up projects. Normally I just start very simple. I don't add lots of different folders from the start, but I just add them as I go. But I do have a standard way of setting it up for myself, so that if I work on different projects, that it's easy for me to find things. So things like I will always have a source folder, I'll always have a tests folder, I'll have a doc folder. So those are always going to be there, and then depending on what the project needs, I'll add more folders to it. Let's see. What else do we have? Zachary asked, what's the best way to protect source code in Electron? Yeah, so Electron, obviously, there's not really an easy way to do that. You could think about things like code minifying and obfuscation. There are some tools for that. But honestly, the question is, how important is it? I mean, what I've noticed is that code itself is not magic. You're often just using existing platforms. It's also pretty hard to just copy code by someone else and then turn that into something that you can use, because it's going to be very specific. So it's something that's like when I started my first company, we were also developing a web platform, and we were also worried about people stealing our code, and honestly that never happens and nobody really cares. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. GTMate, are you planning to make videos on frameworks for web development in Python? I could certainly do that. I mean, I did do a video series a while ago about Dash, which is more like a financial dashboard, but web-based, and there's other types of frameworks. I'm not sure Python is the best choice for web development. I think there are better tools in the TypeScript world that I think are better. So I'm not sure how much I will focus on that. But if you have some suggestion, just let me know. Let's see. Philippe asked how to make a sanity check in the data with Python. Yeah, so let's call it the data integrity test. So you have your database, and what I often do is that I have a couple of scripts where I just run through the data and verify a couple of things. In particular, things like are the required fields there in tables, and if you have NoSQL database, is even more important because you can just define any data structure basically. So you just have to make sure that the required fields are always there. Things like IDs and relationships are really important. So if one row in a table is referring with an ID to another row in another table, then that's also something you have to check that it actually exists. And in NoSQL, again, you can do the same thing. So what I often do is that I have a script which checks these things. And then I run that script in cloud, and then it gets called like, I don't know, once a day maybe, and then I just run those sanity checks. If you have a lot of data, then you can also implement a sort of randomization of not checking everything, but checking at least a percentage of the data, because otherwise it's going to be too much. But then you run the risk that you won't find errors as soon as you'd like. So only do that when it makes sense. Let's see. Luthane, speaking of scaling, can you get intermediate guide on salary or any good way of scheduling repetitive scripts? Yeah, I've been mainly using just directly cloud systems for that. For example, Google has Cloud Scheduler, and it can just call an HTTP endpoint, and that's typically how I do it. So, and then it defines a cron job so that you can just call it every week or every day or whatever you need. Carlos, oh, thank you so much. You love content, took the course, and you liked it too. Well, glad to hear that. Daniel, what's your favorite type checker in Python? MyPy, PyWrite. I'm using the type checker that's built in with the Python language server in VS Code. So I think that's PyWrite. Pylance uses PyWrite. I think that's how it works. Jasin, how can you call Python functions in a TypeScript project? Depends on why you want to do that, obviously. But one way to do it is that if it's a Node.js server, you can actually start a process and execute a shell command, and then you could then call the Python interpreter with a Python file, and then you can run some Python code. Another way to do it is that you deploy the Python functions as REST endpoints in the cloud, and then you call that. Chris asks, do you think doing work with a professor is a good path? If you are interested in more the research side of things, then I think that's definitely nice. I mean, a professor is going to give you a lot of feedback on, especially if it's like a data science area that you're going to work on, then a professor is going to probably give you a lot of nice feedback on how to do data analysis and how to make sure that you're measuring the right things. If you are looking to just become a software engineer, I don't think a professor is really the expert on that, because they're more research focused. Then it would be better to do an internship at a company and learn that way. It's probably going to be quicker. Stefan asks, I'm a SRE and I really am getting deep into software development. Actually, and I'm absolutely failing at landing an interview. No responses from any company after 100 plus applications. Yeah, so it depends, of course, very much on what is in your CV and how you applied. I think, and also the types of companies that you're applying to. If you apply to bigger companies, they're going to have more stricter rules on the type of people that they are going to accept. Smaller companies are generally a bit more flexible and personalized, so you might get better results if you're targeting smaller companies. And then, of course, you have to make sure that on your CV you're actually clearly indicating what your capabilities are, and maybe refer to some projects you did in the past, open source things that you contributed to, things like that. Max asks, how much Python should I know before learning my second language, JavaScript? I'm trying to master Python first, but it seems it could take plenty of time. Yeah, so, I mean, in part, what I really like about learning multiple languages is that they kind of feed off each other. I think if you learn both Python and JavaScript, and you shouldn't start with, like, if you don't have programming experience, with learning two languages at the same time. I think that's going to be very confusing. But it is really nice to learn a second language pretty soon, especially because it also makes you realize how different programming languages are and how they've been set up and why they work in a particular way. So learning JavaScript might actually help you learn Python faster, because there's going to be some overlap, and it's also going to help you understand how Python has been set up and why it has been set up in that particular way. So if I wouldn't recommend that you just dive only in Python and do only that for an extremely long time until you sort of decide that you're an expert. I think it's really helpful to learn another language soon, because it's going to give you a broader view of how programming languages work. Jermaine, what services would you recommend to host remote databases? A Postgres instance for our Django REST framework project whose purpose is to expose an API. Yeah, so most cloud providers actually provide this out of the box. So Google Cloud, Azure, AWS, they all have a way to spin up a database on the fly. It's really easy, just a few clicks and then you have a database. So that's really simple. If you're looking for a NoSQL instance, I've had good experience just with MongoDB Atlas, and they even have a free tier where you can have a sandbox database. That's actually pretty good, and you can just use that for free forever. So so that's actually also pretty nice. So either Google Cloud or Azure or AWS, they can all do that. Tushar, have you heard of tried MyPyC? It takes fully type-checked Python code compiled to fast C extensions. No, I haven't heard of that, so I'll take a look at that. Thanks for mentioning that. Peter, what's your thought on ChatGPT? Oh my, here we go. So is it going to take away all of our jobs? No, I don't think so. Is it going to change a lot of things for us? Yes. I mean, if you look at how fast things are going, then yes, it's absolutely going to change a lot of things. But what I really noticed is that, especially over the last week, where, you know, with Microsoft, with the Bing announcement, it looks like the whole thing that ChatGPT actually does is some sort of really smart search. It's not really taking any decisions, right? We still have to take the decisions. It's just that we can search faster and we can get the results that we need faster. So I think it's just going to help us become more awesome, basically, and work faster and find answers to problems faster. So it's going to increase our productivity. It's certainly going to change jobs because, well, I might do a video about that where I actually think, like, I've tried using ChatGPT last week to design a new piece of software. And what was really funny is that it actually works really pretty well, actually. And it's almost like viewing like having a sparring partner and talking with the sparring partner and asking questions. But what's really important is that you ask the right questions. And you need to develop a certain mindset of how do I pose the questions that are going to give me useful answers. So that's, I think, something as developers we're going to have to learn. How do you interact with an AI? Because it's not like a person that you talk with. It's different. It's not going to take decisions for you. So I think that's what we need to learn. And I think that also means that it's not going to replace developers. It's just going to change the way we work. And that's nothing special. I mean, lots of tools, platforms, technologies change the way we work all the time. So ChatGPT is nothing different in that sense. Han, thank you. I think Python is a nice language and I see writing code as an art. Yeah, you could definitely see it like that. It's a bit like mathematics, you know, some mathematicians, they really like viewing a certain proof or the way that a mathematical model works. It has an element of beauty, and I think code also has that. So I totally agree with that, yeah. All right, let's see. What else do we have? Ross, Python evolves. Will the code I write in 2023 run in 2033? How often typically will I need to rewrite my code? I think you shouldn't think about 10-year plans for code. I mean, unless you work at a bank or something where things are still being built in COBOL. Write your code for what it needs to do now and assume that you are anyway going to change it all the time, because that's what coding basically is. So the only way that code in 2023 is going to run in 2033 is if you actually maintain it and update it. Because, I mean, you could still maybe run the code, but it's just going to be very complicated. And it's also speeding up. So things that maybe in the past you could run for a long time. Nowadays, things are changing so fast that it's not possible anymore. Rolando asks, I've been out of coding for some while doing infrastructure, left at Python 3.7. What would you do to catch up? Yes, I would definitely look at some of the new features like I think 3.7 it already had like f strings and things like that. But string enums, maybe go through the release notes of the newer Python versions and to check what's in there. I also did a few videos about Python updates that you can check out. But I mean, at the core didn't really change of Python. It's still Python 3. Pratik asks, hey Arjan, how to master data structures as a fresher who's looking for college placement? Yeah, data structures is something that I haven't spent a lot of time on myself on the channel. I think it is definitely important. It's also sort of related with types and data classes. I did cover, obviously. I think there's a difference between, let's say, what you would learn in a computer science education program, which is more about learning data structures like trees and linked lists and maps, and then learning about algorithms to search them or resort them or things like that. It's often in the real world you won't actually build those tools because there's going to be libraries that supply those data structures. But what is really important practically is that you make sure you pick the right one, because depending on the data structure, it's going to be good or less good at certain types of operations. Like, for example, if you need to search, then a list is probably not a very good data structure for you, and something like a dictionary might work better, where you can have order, log, and search time. Or if you need immutability, then a tuple might be a better choice. So depending on what you need, pick the data structure that is the most suitable. Let's see, what else do we have? Niels, recently a close colleague of mine left for a new job, and looking into some of their code base that I did not collaborate with them on. Found that some of the code was really badly structured, and I've had to give up on refactoring code because it's so badly structured. How do you deal with really bad code made by others? Yeah, a funny story. I watched a talk a couple of years ago. I think it was by one of the founders of Booking.com. It's a Dutch company. You probably know if you've ever been in a hotel. But they were actually using for a very long time a script that did hotel room availability checks. And nobody actually dared touching that script because it was like so incomprehensible and so complex that nobody dared touch it. I think that's a good example. I think if code is really, really badly structured, I mean, this is like almost an impossible problem to solve, right? What you could try to do is think of the minimum thing that you could do to replace part of the code without breaking too much. Like what, if you look at the whole mess, basically what area do you think is going to be the least impacted if you try to change things? Because even if things are badly structured, there is going to be some sort of structure. So you should be able to find an area like that, and then you start there, and then step by step you can move in deeper and do more refactoring work. But the most important thing is to always make sure that you have a working version, because as long as you have a working version, it's going to be much easier to manage. Like, why don't you want to work at huge tech companies? Well, for me personally, I think I don't, yeah, how do I say this? What I find gives me the most purpose in my life is being able to do something that has a positive impact on people. And for me, that's easier to understand if the team is small, or if it's basically my own thing, because then I still get a grasp of, hey, this is what I'm doing and this has a positive effect, right? Like, for example, if I do a helpful YouTube video on, I don't know, Fast API or whatever, and I get comments that people say, oh, that's great, it's very helpful. So that's a very direct result for me, and that motivates me to continue. And that's really how my brain works. At a large tech company, you're really going to be like a tiny screw in a very large machine that you're never going to fully understand, because you're not going to move up to a level in the company, well, that unless for a very few people, that you're going to have the total overview of the system. So you're always going to be a cog in the machine, and that's just not something that I'm interested in. I prefer to create my own machine or be part of a smaller machine. It feels more natural to me. Let's see. Hazi asks, will you ever release a course on Python frameworks, etc.? Yeah, I did one in Skillshare actually recently, which is a course on more intermediate concepts in Python. There's a link in one of my latest videos. You can take a look. All right, let's see. What else do we have? 2BD Kids. Arjan, what kind of balance do you like between a product team designer creating system requirements versus dev team creating them? At the moment, we have no product team and no requirements. Well, you will certainly have requirements, but they're going to be hidden and they're going to pop up after the fact, which is not really what you want to do. I mean, if you are a development team, you need to know why you're building stuff and who you're building it for. And you need to talk to those people and figure out what they want, right? Even if you don't have a specific team for that, you still need to do that. And I think it's not a good idea that the development team does that, because basically you need to focus on building the tools, and you have the technical know-how to understand how to set that up, but you need somebody that has a more separate point of view. That's, let's say, between the development team, which is very technically focused, and the customer, who's very outcome focused, that there is somebody that can translate what needs to be done and communicate between these two things. So I think that's actually really important. Libra, thank you for all of your fantastic tutorials. You're most welcome. Thank you so much. Quick question, why would one use data classes when dictionaries would do the trick most of the time, or am I missing something? Well, dictionaries are really a mapping from a string, normally. Well, you don't have to use a string, you can also use something else, from a string to one specific other type. So you can have a dictionary from strings to, I don't know, product objects, or from strings to, or from ints to customers or whatever. Data classes in general, have instance variables that can have a combination of different types of things. So if you have a customer class, a customer is going to have a name, address, zip code, phone number, email address, maybe age or birth date or whatever. So those are different things. And that's not so easy to put into a dictionary, simply because the dictionary is just a mapping from one type to something of another type. And the second thing is that there's very little checking in dictionaries unless you're using a typed dictionary, so that you don't know which entries in the dictionary are going to be available. Whereas with classes, you can sort of force that to be there. So, and then the IDE helps you a bit better. I do like dictionaries a lot, though. I think they're really great for mapping options. So if you have something like a factory, you need to build something or call a function depending on some value that you get from data, then dictionaries are actually really useful. All right, let's see. David asks, how do you build security into your system without being a cyber security expert? It's mainly important if you don't have the expertise to do things properly in terms of security. You need to get help. You need to find maybe somebody that can just do a review of your code to make sure that there are no leaks. And there's actually companies that do that. So I would definitely recommend that you do that. Another thing you can do to sort of reduce the dependence on, or let's say to reduce the chance that you're going to make a mistake, by relying on frameworks as much as possible. So if you don't feel comfortable with, let's say, authentication flows, don't build your own authentication flows, but use something like Auth0 or something, which is authentication as a service. And then they will take care of the authentication aspect, so you don't have to worry about that. And there's other platforms that you can use as well. Let's see, cool administrator. Can you do a tutorial on what enums are and how, where to use them? Yeah, for sure. That's actually a good suggestion. I use them often to define categories of things. So if I have a fixed number of categories, the string enums in Python 3.11 are actually also pretty nice. So I tend to use them quite a lot. Yeah. Aima Draku asks, in my projects, I often use data class, and except I need a more complex constructor, I almost always see myself using data classes. Are there downsides to that approach? Well, I don't really think so. I use them really quite a lot myself. Data classes are a great option. I think one thing that can potentially be confusing with data classes is the way that they define instance variables. So you have to get used to that, because if you would do that in a normal class, then those would actually be class variables and not instance variables. Data classes also add extra things to your classes, like object comparison. You will get a string representation automatically and a couple of other things. You don't always need that, so it might actually lead to more code if you use data classes all over the place. You should also be careful with using data classes in, let's say, representing large data sets, because they will incur some overhead because they have all those extra methods. Let's see, Barsaman, any books you recommend to improve Python knowledge? Yeah, I don't read a lot of Python books specifically. I tend to follow more along tutorials online, look at the Python documentation, which is always up to date. So for me, that works better. If you really want to become better at Python, you can take a look at some of the books that are more about coding in general, like Clean Code or Clean Architecture by Robert Martin. Let's see, Lucas, thanks for the tutorials. You're most welcome. I'm glad you like the teaching style. Ben, do you have a suggestion for a good starter framework for a desktop app, mainly for computer vision projects? Also, GUI is a requirement. Well, there's certainly things like Qt, which are a great starting point for building GUIs. Computer vision projects specifically, you might have some graphics demands, maybe something like using Plotly or Dash or Streamlit. Those are good tools to build all sorts of dashboards, so maybe that's useful for you. Let's see, Eric. Hi, Arjan. When would you prefer to use Pydantic over data classes? I'm going to do a video very soon where I compare data classes, Pydantic, and attrs. Data classes is sort of a simpler version of attrs. It's built on the ideas of attrs, but then put into the standard library. Where Pydantic really shines over data classes is that it has lots of options for validation, and that works really, really well. It also is the standard solution to use with things like SQL Alchemy, and so if you're developing APIs, Pydantic is really great. The only thing is that it is a third-party library, so you do need to install it. And also it relies on inheritance. So it has a base model and you make a subclass of that, and that's how you sort of define your Pydantic models. So Pydantic does mean that it sort of, yeah, let's say conflicts almost with the idea of composition over inheritance if you're not careful. And it might be confusing, like the base model is going to implement some methods, and if you accidentally override one of those methods, you're going to have a problem. So I do prefer the approach that data classes and attrs as well follows, but Pydantic is a really nice package. Let's see, Carlos, what are the packages that you use the most on your projects? Also, for what kind of projects do you usually use Python for? Yeah, so I use it a lot for integrations and automations. So I have on my Instagram, I have a URL that points to the latest video on YouTube. So I have a simple Python REST endpoint that takes the latest video from my YouTube channel and then updates the link in Cloudflare. Or if I sell one of my online courses, I have a Python backend that integrates with both Stripe, which is my payment provider, and my accounting system, generates the invoice automatically, computes the right tax percentages, sends the invoice by email, things like that. So that's what I also use Python for. So it's mostly these types of automations and connections between systems. I think Python works really well for that. Packages that I use most are things like Pydantic, Fast API. Still use Flask quite a bit because that's what Google Cloud Functions use. So mostly those things, and PyTest for writing software tests. Thomas. Hi Arjan, can I create a job server using Fast API to enable a worker script to pull and parse JSON as parameters required for the tasks? Are there better options for creating a job server? I wouldn't start with creating that all yourself from scratch, because most of the cloud providers already have something like that you can use out of the box. So unless you really need something very specific, I would first look into the built-in tools and see if you can just use that, because it's already there. And they will have other options like being able to run concurrently several tasks and indicating how many of those tasks you want to run concurrently, cool-off times, things like that. Let's see. I'm Adraco. Did you already do a video about annotations, like comments and docstrings? I'm often uncertain when and how I should comment, and to which classes, functions it makes sense to add a docstring. In my videos, I've used, in the beginning, I didn't use docstrings, but then I switched to using docstrings. But then actually it didn't really help explain the concepts very well, because my videos are sort of the docstring, but then in video format. So I just removed them again and kept the code really short. It works better for videos, especially in combination with automatic documentation generation systems. It's actually really useful to have them. But you also want to make sure that they're easy to maintain for you. And lots of documentation generation systems, they actually also look at type annotations. So if you are strict about your type annotations in Python, it's going to save you a lot of work, because then you don't have to write all of that in a docstring. And your IDE can help you understand how the code fits together. All right, let's see. Andron asks, hi Arjan, I'm a middle Python dev, want to become better at coding. Would you mind to tell ways how to become better? I think for me personally, what really made a big difference is really doing different projects and not just focusing on one programming language, but also learning other programming languages. For me, that was really changed. It changed really a lot in understanding how programming languages work and how software is set up. So if you want to become better, I think that's a really good place to start. DRMR, how to find a Python job that's not in fintech, e-commerce, or requiring Django. Yeah, there's a lot of Django developers. You're struggling on the job market. Yeah, the job market is in a pretty bad place, of course, with all the layoffs. I don't think it's going to last very long, because there's always going to be demand for software developers, and I think it's just we're just in sort of a lull. But if you're looking for something that's not in fintech, e-commerce, you might think about maybe looking more in the DevOps field or automation field. I think there are some jobs you can find there. Okay, Epic 9 fail. How can you avoid over-engineering? I frequently become obsessed with new features, which leads to development of overly convoluted solutions. Yeah, that's an easy trap to fall into. I've fallen into that trap also, where you try to make the code so nice and generic that it can do everything you want, but then it also becomes really hard to use, basically, because it can do everything. So there's a lot of, you create something that's incredibly hard to use, but it's very generic, and that's really a problem. What really helps is approach it very much from the outcome, like what's the minimum thing that you need in order to produce the outcome that you desire. You can also look at it way more from the test perspective, like what's the minimum program that you need in order for the tests to pass. That's test-driven development. And that sort of forces you to keep things really simple. So I think for me, it took me a few years to basically get out of that idea of always trying to find the most generic and most nice solution, where it's often just about practically solving a problem and keeping things really simple. Then next question. Let's see. Thomas, did you already use Falcon API? I haven't, no. So I might take a look at that. I do really like Fast API though. So I haven't looked at Falcon API in depth, so I don't think I can answer your question at the moment. Maybe later I will look at it in a future video. All right, let's see. Joel, love your videos, design patterns. Thank you, glad you like them. How can I become better at recognizing when to use what patterns in my daily work? Yeah, it's the way it sort of evolved for me is that when I started, I learned about design patterns during my studies, computer science studies. And in the beginning, I was pretty strict about, and I was really considering when I was writing my code, thinking, okay, what pattern could be used here? I was really approaching it that way. But what happens as you use these patterns more, that you start to see the structures that they sort of build on. There's design principles that are underlying these patterns. Things like reducing coupling or increasing cohesion or separating, creating things from using them. And most of the patterns are actually varieties of those things. So there's some abstraction, there's some composition, and that's basically what it is. So after a while, you start to think more in those terms. And then I rarely think about specific design patterns anymore. So for me, that's how it progressed. And solutions is I look a lot at, well, there's like some red flags that I see in code that trigger me in thinking, oh, hey, maybe I should do something about that. Like if there's a lot of duplication, for example, then you should probably use some sort of pattern or principle to clean that up. If you have a long series of if-else statements, if the type is this, then do that, else if the type is that, do that, that's often a good candidate for a strategy pattern or a higher order function or something like that. So often it's these type of structures that you recognize in code that then lead you to rethinking how you should design things. Let's see. Guinea pig, for how long? How much longer will you be streaming? Not that much longer. I'm getting a bit tired, but I'll stay for a few more minutes. Let's see. How can you get an awesome Dutch accent? Well, move to the Netherlands and learn Dutch, which is apparently very hard. There's lots of, how do you say? There's lots of exceptions to the grammar rules. So for Dutch is a pretty hard language to learn. And there's also the pronunciation, which is, it has a lot of these strong sounds like the and the and these things, so that makes it a bit hard to learn. But you will certainly develop a Dutch accent if you do that. All right, Matthew asked, what are your favorite plotting packages, dashboard packages? Yeah, so I've looked at Dash mainly and Plotly. Streamlit also looks really nice. So those two, I've used Dash a bit, but basically that's it. Zachariah, what's the best software architecture for a point of sale system? So in terms of architecture, you will probably have some sort of RESTful backend or a GraphQL backend, and that's going to be the interaction or that's basically going to be the way that you interact with a system like that. You're also going to need an integration with a payment system like Stripe or PayPal, and they will probably work with webhooks, so that if you get referred to the payment system, then they're going to want to have a webhook, so you also need to support that. So that's let's say the most important part of a point of sale system. All right, I just need to blow my nose, by the way. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. We'll cut that out of the live stream after I edit it. All right. Jurash says, I want to do major refactoring on a project. It's an information system, but I have problems about how to determine the relevant endpoints in REST. Is there a rule about defining the REST interface? Well, I mean, the most important thing if you set up an interface that you start with how you expect people are going to use it. And that informs the structure of your REST interface. So what are the main concepts and what are the main things that you would like to do? And remember that a REST interface, it doesn't have to be a direct mapping on the database. Often REST systems are built like this, that you have all your different object types in a database. You have, I don't know, customers, orders, line items, whatever, and each one of them is going to have an endpoint. So up to a certain level, it's going to be like that, but also consider how your end user is going to want to use your system and set up your REST interface in such a way that that's the easiest possible. So you could, for example, start by thinking about the main tasks that your users will want to do and map out the flows of what steps they're going to take to do that. So if, let's say, you're doing a hotel booking API or something, you could map out a flow of a customer getting information about rooms that are available, then reserving a room, then paying the order, and then finally getting an email automatically with a reserved room or something like that. So then once you have that flow, you can think about how to set up your REST API so that it supports that flow as naturally, as intuitively as possible. All right, one pot dish, which programming language do you use at work? Python for everything. Yeah, I do quite a bit of Python, like what I said, especially for automation, and the other main language I use is TypeScript. And I use that a lot in my other company for both the backend and the front end. DigiRide, I know you try to keep your videos small-ish. Would it be within the framework of your videos to provide a limited example of a stateless state system? I don't know exactly what you mean. Sorry. Can you clarify? Guillermo, hi Arjan, love your videos. They help me a lot in work as a software engineer. What would you say are the major difference between a junior developer and a senior one? So often what you see is that the junior developer is going to be good at one programming language, is going to need a lot of direction in order to do a task. So a junior developer will, given the constraints and given specifically the task that needs to be done, will be able to do the task. As senior developer, you will be working more on a higher level. You'll be working more on also defining how to solve a problem, or looking at different technologies and thinking about the optimal solution for that. And next to that, a senior developer is probably going to have more knowledge about specific algorithms, design principles and patterns, way to set up code properly so that it's easy to change, easy to test. So that's to me, that's one of the main difference. Thomas, when is the next code roast and how can we make submissions? Yeah, so you can submit code roasts via the Discord server. So there's a free Discord community that I have. The link is in all of my videos. So if you just click on description, you will find it, discord.arjan.codes. And we have a channel where you can post your project. It's been a while since I did one, so I should really think about doing another code roast soon. But I've just so many ideas and videos that I want to do that it's hard for me to find the time. Joskin, how do I identify when not to use object-oriented design in Python? Yeah, so I typically don't really start with object-oriented design myself. I noticed that I really focus more on defining things in terms of functions nowadays. Object-oriented design is a good starting point if you're thinking about modeling your data and what the main concepts are in your system and how they're related. But in terms of behavior, it's also often good to think about more a functional approach and then start there. Joskin, did you lose weight? Yeah, I did lose some weight. I've been doing some sports and weightlifting again over the last month. Kind of when I first got my kids, that sort of fell off my list of priorities. So lately I've been getting back into shape a bit, and I must say it's more important than you think. I feel like we tend to spend sometimes too much time on, when you're a software developer, on thinking about, okay, what technology should I learn and what library should I know about, and etc., etc. But actually, it's really important to eat well and exercise, and if you feel better in your body, if you feel more at ease, you have a clearer mind, I think that has a huge impact on how well you're able to learn things and how quickly you're able to progress. Let's see. Virtual Radar +1 question about tips for migrating Python 2 code. Yeah, I'm not sure there are maybe tools to help do some of that work automatically. Honestly, I never had to do Python 2 code migration myself, since the last time I used Python 2, that was like many years ago, and I didn't really use that code anymore. I was still working at the university then, and it was not really an issue. And when I started my companies here, I already used Python 3 for everything. So I can't really give you any specific tips on that. Cool Administrator asks when to use async I/O versus threading. Async I/O is really great for dealing with API calls and things like that, and it allows you to have a simple interface in which you can do things concurrently and not have to wait one by one on the responses. So that's where async I/O works really well. Threading, on the other hand, is, I'd say, more useful if you're working more internally on something where you need to do things concurrently. And in that case, you might want to, let's say you need to process lots of data and you want to use different CPU cores to do all the processing, so then you might create multiple threads. Though in Python, that might actually not work because of the global interpreter lock, but you can use processing to get around that. Will, hey, I'm going to the US for a master in computer science. I've barely any knowledge in data structure since I have only 4 months. Any tips on which technologies I should focus to secure a job? If you're going to do a master, then I wouldn't worry too much about getting a job at the same time, because you need to focus on finishing your master. Maybe you need a job to pay the bills, that's possible. But it's often more efficient to just do the master and then find a job right after that than trying to find a job halfway your master, and then your master is going to take longer, which means you're also going to need to pay tuition fees longer. So typically do the master, then find a job. Zachary, I hope you can make a tutorial about building a simple project using design patterns and how to choose the right software architecture. Yeah, so it's definitely something I can think about. The challenge always for me is how I can make sure that it fits in a YouTube video. And the YouTube algorithm is unfortunately very strict. For example, splitting things up in multiple parts really doesn't work all that well on YouTube. So I have to find a way to do it in a way that works with YouTube. All right. Tim Huff, any tips on reading config files and validating user-provided configurations? I want to raise exceptions if provided values that aren't valid. Any best practices? Yeah, so what you can definitely look into is Pydantic, because that has a lot of validation, and then you can basically read JSON data and create a Pydantic object from that. And Pydantic is going to do a lot of the conversion for you. Like, for example, if your JSON file contains date-time information, Pydantic is going to convert it to a proper date-time object. And then you can add all sorts of validations on single fields, but also things like making sure that a collection of fields is there in the JSON data, etc. So Pydantic is a great start. Lelia, hi, I'm from Colombia. Love your channel. Thank you so much. Glad to hear that. Recently, I've been learning CloudFormation. For me, it was tough to create everything in a declarative way. Do you have any advice for me? Yeah, I haven't used CloudFormation specifically. It's definitely something that's going to take you some time, because that's not really the standard way that you would write code in Python. I would say maybe the best way to start is to look at other declarative programming languages to get more of a conceptual idea for how it works. For example, tools like Excel or Airtable or these kind of things. But yeah, it's a bit, it's a hard question to answer for me, to be honest. Luca asked, do you know Guido van Rossum in person? No, I don't know Guido van Rossum in person. Spiros, I wrote thousands of lines of Python code for my thesis. You said we need to maintain it. So these lines will have to be rewritten. Why so? No, I didn't say you have to maintain all code you ever write. I mean, I think I've written currently probably tens of thousands of lines of code that just ended up in the bin somewhere. So I really don't think you should maintain all the code. You should maintain the code that you're still using and that you think makes sense to maintain because you can use it in the future. So I'm sort of opportunistic about it, and I don't mind throwing away code if I know that I'm no longer going to use it anyway. I mean, I probably keep the repository somewhere, but yeah, I don't really bother with that. Like, for example, a couple of years ago, I was playing around with doing trading with cryptocurrency, so I wrote a little server backend to I don't know, compute, to do technical analysis and figure out which type of things to buy and sell. I mean, it never really worked out, but I don't feel the need to now maintain that code because I'm not using it. So why should I do that? I have other better things to do. Virat, you take time, make great videos, watch every video you post with interest, try to implement it with our products. Thank you. Greetings from Turkey. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Zakaria, what's the best way to use threads to load data from databases without problems? Mainly make sure that you're using transactions and using commits and rollback. That's kind of the standard way to deal in databases with this type of multi-threaded access. Did you write? Thanks for hard work. I send new Python programs to you first. Yes, please do. Please send them to me. Spiros, what do we need to maintain and rewrite the code? So, well, that's, I'd say, very generic question. Yeah, so if we do not maintain it, it won't run. Well, there is going to be a point where old code is going to have problems, because code doesn't run in a vacuum, right? Especially not nowadays anymore. So you will rely on a bunch of different external dependencies. I mean, even if you put them in requirements, there is probably going to be a potential issue if you're not careful, because there's lots of moving factors, like what is the Python environment that you're using, what machine are you using this on, and so you have your code, and surrounding your code there's going to be a bunch of variables that are going to change, and no matter what, you can't really do anything about it. Or let's say if you have code that runs in clouds, then cloud providers are going to change things all the time about the the versions of Docker containers that they're going to be using, or if you're using something like Google Cloud, it's going to switch to a different version of Python or other dependencies. So there's just too many variables that might affect that your code may no longer run, even if you didn't change anything. So the longer you don't maintain code, the higher the chances that you're going to run into some sort of issue. And unfortunately, because code applications get more complex, they have more and more dependencies, and the longer you wait, and also the more complex it is to actually keep things up to date and running as you want them to. Did you write something different? Have you ever worked with home automation and Python? Not really, though it could be an interesting thing to look on. I haven't done that myself. Any tips on targeting multiple Python versions with a code base? How long should we keep older Python versions alive? Yeah, that depends very much on the way that your tool is being used. If you're stuck to a particular Python version because of some old tool that's not being updated that relies on that particular Python version, well, then you're going to have to maintain it for a longer time. And then there's also the risk of if you are too modern and you always use the latest version of Python, that some of the libraries, packages that you use may not work correctly because maybe the newest version of Python that switch introduced some sort of bug or something. So there's also a danger there. So it's always a balance. Ned, speaking of test-driven development, could you elaborate further about that in the context of requirements often changing as development continues, thus making those initial TDD assumptions null? Yeah, so the whole idea of test-driven development is that, well, you write your test first, but you also only write the minimum amount of code so that the tests pass. And the tests themselves, they actually come from the requirements. So the requirements are going to state things like if you enter your PIN card, then it should ask for the PIN code. And if you enter the wrong PIN code, then you should see this error and these kind of things. So that's what requirements are going to be like. They're going to be phrased like that. And then you can write the tests that verify that those requirements are being met. Now, regardless of whether you're using test-driven development or anything else, requirements are going to change because they always change. And they change because we learn things while we're developing things. So that means that test-driven development in that sense is actually a really good match, because there's always going to be the translation from the requirements to the tests, and then from the tests to the working software. If the requirements change, well, then it means you need to translate that into, okay, so what tests do we need to change? Do we need to add tests? And then, again, once you do that, well, a bunch of those tests are going to fail because you didn't implement them yet or something changed. So then the next step is updating the implementation so that the test again passed. So it's a pretty natural flow of things, actually. Chris asks, what would you recommend for a beginner to get a job as a web developer, Flask or Django? Do you think that companies require higher fluidity in one or another? I wouldn't focus too much on specific technologies. I think lots of companies also understand that it's more important that you are able to show that you can learn new technologies. And then, you might know Django, but probably it won't then be a problem for you to learn Flask or the other way around. Igor asks, should principles of clean architecture always be applied when creating medium to large systems? It is going to make things a lot easier if you do, because the ideas of clean architecture really lead to systems that are easier to manage, obviously. But yeah, it depends. It also depends on, because sometimes you don't even have a choice. Like if you're tied to a specific cloud provider that has things set up in a certain way, you may not be able to use the principles of clean architecture, all of them, because you're tied to that specific cloud system. Artus, how do you efficiently organize potentially really large projects? There are quite some resources on how to start a project, but things tend to get extremely hard to navigate over time anyways. It's almost an impossible situation to avoid, to be honest. It basically, for us, how we did it in our company is that we always reserve some time for cleanup and refactoring, because basically every time you add a new component to your software platform, it's going to change things throughout the platform. So every time you add a new concept or you change your concepts, you're going to need to revise the code and restructure things so that it's again easy to change, easy to use. And the larger the platform becomes, the more work this becomes. And that's also why startup companies typically can move pretty fast, because they have a small code base that they're working on. But as you progress, your code base becomes more complex, and you need to spend more and more and more time on testing and making sure things stay manageable, and etc., etc. So software development really slows down a lot after a while because of that reason. Guinea pig, for what are you looking when you do a code roast? I'm currently looking at some older code and it's pretty bad, but I feel a lot of issues have been covered in other videos. Yeah, so for code roast, I typically like to do projects that are sort of standalone, so that it's not a ridiculously complex thing, so that it's doable to cover that in a video. And I also typically look for something that where there are some clear issues in the code that allow me to latch on some design principles and design patterns so that I can show how they actually work. Spiros, given the need for maintenance of Python code, if I buy your course today, what I will learn will stay relevant for how long? 5 years. Well, the principles I teach in the course, they are already, let's say, 20 years old. So I think the principles, they will be relevant for a long time. I can't give a guarantee, obviously, but they've been relevant since the 90s, and they're also going to be relevant in the coming years. It's mostly about making sure you think logically about problems and setting up things so that things stay simple. Since it's a design course, it's not really about maintaining Python code. And of course, I mean, the course I'm going to update it. I've done that already a couple of times, so that means that if there are significant changes, I'm just going to update the course and add new material to cover that. Zachary, is there any way to use PostgreSQL locally, like SQLite or not? Is there any alternative? Well, one thing you could do is actually use Docker. So you could have a Docker container that contains an installation of PostgreSQL. I'm sure there are already containers that have that. So you could just get those and run it locally on your machine using Docker. And then you have your PostgreSQL server in a Docker container. Note though that you will lose all the data once you destroy the container. So it's really for local testing only. Josh asks, would you do a deep dive on the import machinery? Yeah, I did cover that in my course for a bit, but I might also do it on the YouTube channel in a while. It's a good suggestion. Thanks. Presamak asks, do you plan to touch telemetry, observability tracing in Python, similar as a video on logging? Thank you for this one and for your great work. You're most welcome. Yeah, I've started doing like some of these videos where I take a closer look at the built-in modules and see what you can do with the built-in modules. I haven't looked a lot at debugging, tracing, and things like that in my videos. That's definitely a great topic. I don't see why not. BCX, what do you think about ChatGPT? It does a pretty good job of optimizing code, but sometimes can be annoying if you don't change the prompt properly. Yeah, so I think the main thing with ChatGPT is that we need to learn how to interact with it, and that also happens with other technology. So like let's say even Google search. I mean, we had to learn how to use Google search and put in the right keywords and ask the right things so that you can find what you're looking for. So with ChatGPT, I think that's it's the same. We just have to learn how to use it, and then we will get better at it. Kushal, why your course is so freaking expensive? Yeah, it is a bit expensive. I'm sorry. I'm working on something that's a bit cheaper. For me, the reason to, well, let's put it this way. For me, the reason to ask a higher price is that I really see it as, let's say, the main thing that I do. So to me, it doesn't make sense to charge 10 euros or something for that, because I really spent a lot of time on it, and I'm going to continue to spend a lot of time on it. So it's really something that I want to continue building, and that's why I'm more expensive than, let's say, courses on Udemy. Another thing is that I really try to focus on not just collecting a bunch of information and putting it in a course and then selling that, but really thinking about, okay, if you are a more junior developer and you want to take the steps in your career to become a more senior developer, like what are the important things for you to know beyond just the information that you find online? So that's how I structure it a bit differently. But honestly, if the course is too expensive for you, I totally understand. And I think you can get a lot of value already from the YouTube channel. So to me, that's for me, that feels like a good balance, because I do have lots of free stuff, and by not charging too little for the course, I can actually use the income to invest also in making the free stuff a lot better. So I can buy a better camera and a better microphone and better lights and better everything. So that's always a balance of finding what works. And yeah, this is the balance that I chose. Let's see, what else do we have? Yo, any serious web application eventually gets to writing JavaScript for Pythonistas that are new to JavaScript? What are the common gotchas and differences? I think a difference is that JavaScript, you have a very different way of dealing with dependencies. JavaScript itself, or TypeScript, doesn't have a lot of built-in things. So you're going to need to very quickly install all sorts of packages. And then you get into a whole ecosystem of node modules and dependencies, which can be pretty overwhelming. If you're in Python, already the standard installation of Python with the standard library covers a lot of what you need. And you don't need to install a bunch of extra stuff in order to get started with Python. So I'd say that's the key difference between something like JavaScript and Python. Another key difference is that the aim of JavaScript is very different from the aim of Python. So Python has a strongly typed system. And that means you can't do things like adding strings and numbers and things like that, because you need to specifically indicate to Python the type. And that's just how Python has been set up. JavaScript, on the other hand, is really optimized for the browser experience. And that means that let's say the builders of the language have done their best to make sure that JavaScript always does something sensible, even though it contains errors and type issues. So JavaScript is weakly typed, and that means that if you don't watch out, it's going to do stuff to make sure that the code sort of works, so that at least the user sees a website. But it also means that you are going to be chasing all sorts of weird bugs, because JavaScript does very little reporting on what's actually wrong with the code. And that's also a key difference between a language like JavaScript and Python. So Python has more checks. It's going to give better reporting to you. JavaScript is just not going to do that. It's just going to, if something is undefined, it's just going to silently ignore that. And that's, of course, also why a language like TypeScript have been developed to be a bit more strict and provide a bit more, let's say, handles for the developer, so that we actually know what's going on in the code. All right, I'm just going to do a few more questions and then I'm going to close the live stream. QSCU, GitHub or GitLab, what do you prefer? I haven't used GitLab all that much, but GitHub for me works pretty well. Kawo, how to get the first programming job as someone who graduated CS at 35, stayed with previous career due to the pandemic. Recruiters don't want to touch my CV due to no commercial Python experience. I think it will help if you take things into your own hands and start, for example, you could work on contribute to some open source projects and get some experience that way. Do your own projects, hobby projects to develop something, put that on GitHub and add that to your portfolio. And then I think you will be able to find a job more easily. Mulogrons, hi, any peek at your plans and goals for your YouTube channel for 2023? Yeah, so my main goal for this year is to, well, I'm not going to produce probably, let's say, more content. I don't want to do 2 videos a week because that's just too hard to manage for me. I do want to continually focus on what I do, try to make that better every time. Just every video, make it like 1% better. And so it's just something that I'm trying to continue doing. At the same time, I might explore some other interesting topics. So either I will do more software architecture related content or a bit more on software testing. I don't think I will do a lot of non-Python content like other programming languages this year, but I might start a few things next year, depending on how it goes. Okay, I'm going to do the final question. Any tips from artists? Any tips on the development workflow. Coming from maths, stats, background, often tend to revert to Jupyter to work on isolated feature, but it doesn't seem to be common practice for most CS. Yeah, I mean, it depends very much on if you need to write a simple script that's just going to do some analysis for you, or if you're really working on an application that runs in the cloud. I mean, then the workflows are obviously going to be very different. Also, whether you're just going to use that on your own versus whether you're going to work in a team, which is going to be more challenging, obviously. Whether you value robustness versus being able to quickly design features. So there's all those things to take into account. Okay, a few more questions. Max, how important are data structures and algorithms in becoming a great software developer? What is the minimum data structure algorithms knowledge I can get away with? I'd say they're pretty important, even though development work is shifting towards relying more on frameworks. It's still incredibly valuable if you have a basic idea of which data structures are going to be suitable and for a particular type of job. So I would not veer too much in like the really low level stuff, but if you look at Python, for example, there's a couple of data structures that you're going to use quite a lot, like dictionaries, tuples, lists, sets sometimes. So it's helpful to know the basics of those data structures, what they're good at, so you can make an informed choice. Jedi Moose, I just wanted to say thanks for what you're doing. You're most welcome. You're a professional Python developer and feel I have benefits. Great to fund your content. I'm happy to hear that. I'm really happy to hear that. Yeah. All right. I'm going to close the live stream for tonight. It was really fun talking with you on Valentine's Day. It was very romantic. I feel like we've really gotten a lot closer. We've gotten to know each other. So our next date is going to be in about a month, in March. Hopefully it will be spring then and a little bit warmer than it is now. It's pretty cold in the Netherlands. But in the meantime, I wish you a great evening. Thank you so much for joining and see you soon on the tubes. Bye-bye.